this morning here with Aaron Porter, formerly of the NUS, President of the NUS, and currently of the NCUB. So the first question I've got for you is, how did you go from your university degree into the role at the NUS as President?
Well, I've had two interesting and in some ways quite different routes. After I graduated, I took on a role that was actually through an election. So I was elected as President of the Students' Union, and then went on to another election to become President of the National Union of Students. And so you could argue that's sort of a garish popularity contest, but it was one route into employment, and it was the route for me. But interestingly, in part through those roles, and there are thousands of students that take on voluntary roles during their time as a university, whether that's as captain of their sports team or involved in their student paper or involved in student societies. It builds up fantastic expertise and experience that can be translated when applying to get a job. And so after I'd finished my time at NUS, I had some discussions with some universities about possible jobs for them, but actually I wanted to work for an organisation that had a business interface as well. And so I'm now in an organisation that works to bring businesses to work together with universities, and that was through, in some ways, a more conventional application route to where I am now.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit more about your role with the NCUB, what that entails, and the sort of interaction you have with universities and businesses?
Yeah, so I'm a director here at the National Centre for Universities and Business, and the core function of the organisation is to make sure that there's effective and enhanced collaboration between businesses that want to work with universities, and indeed vice versa. My role specifically is to try and ensure that the outside world knows about the organisation, but crucially knows about the activity of the organisation. I've got a role to make sure that we engage with our members, and we've got about 90 members that are drawn from largely big corporate FTSE 100 businesses and a range of universities from across the United Kingdom. And principally I'm dealing with the Vice-Chancellors of those universities and the CEOs and the chairs of those businesses.
Fantastic. And is the level of collaboration between businesses and universities in the UK currently high enough, or is there anything we could be doing more to increase collaboration between universities and businesses?
I think the UK is widely regarded to be a world leader in terms of the extent to which businesses and universities work together. There's lots of fantastic ways in which there is excellent research, world-leading research that goes on in our universities that benefit our businesses on a daily basis, whether that's through cutting-edge research that makes drugs in the kind of discovery world that bit more effective and transformational and life-saving, through to new innovations in advanced manufacturing and engineering that means that our businesses can be internationally competitive. But as with most things, things can also improve, and I think we're restless about wanting to ensure there's a whole cadre of businesses that we know could benefit from universities that perhaps as yet don't. Particularly I'm thinking of medium-sized businesses who we know could benefit from university knowledge, but sometimes don't know how to navigate their way through what can seem the complex university organisations. And so we're trying to particularly open that up to the world of business.
And are there any particular barriers in place at the moment that is preventing that collaboration that we could do with removing, or anything to facilitate the ease of interaction between businesses and universities?
Yeah, there are some barriers that both universities and businesses come up against with working with one another. For universities, sometimes it's knowing which businesses could benefit from their research or indeed even their graduate talent. And from businesses, sometimes it's knowing which universities that they could best work with and how to engage with them. Sometimes there are local brokers that can help to kind of facilitate those relationships. The local enterprise partnerships, the LEPs, of which there are 39 in England, they're increasingly playing a role to try and bring businesses and universities together in a local region. Sector skills councils do it on particular disciplines, so in a particular sector, businesses particularly will coalesce and universities can engage with them. Nationally, we're responsible for trying to track the extent to which there's businesses and universities working together, establish good practice as to how it's done and try and share that practice, and then physically brokering relationships between top businesses and universities in the UK.
Fantastic. So from a personal point of view, obviously as President of the NUS, previous to that at the Students' Union at Leicester, working on the graduate paper there, your various roles, you've obviously had to display a degree of adaptability in terms of skills that you can take into particular roles. What sort of skills do you think have been fundamental to your success up to this point, and how important is adaptability in a person's career?
I think clearly everyone has different strengths and weaknesses, and so my approach has been to try and be honest and clear about what I think my particular strengths are, and be conscious of what one's weaknesses are. And so I've tried to exploit as best I can what my particular strengths have been. And for me, I think that's been a knowledge and a passion for higher education and the transformational effect that can have for thousands and indeed tens of thousands and millions of people every single year, but applying that in a particular context, so a policy context in terms of how government makes decisions about how universities are funded, how they're regulated, how they're supported, and trying to then translate that to other audiences like business. I think other more specific things that are possibly not they're not relevant to a particular sector, they're probably transferable across a whole range of different sectors. Things like resilience, drive, determination, enthusiasm. I've always tried to make sure I'm doing work in areas I care about, and I figured that if I care about the area that I work in, then actually I won't really see it as a job at all, and actually I'll just want to constantly be involved, and certainly that's how I feel about the areas of work I'm involved in, and that counted as much for advocating on behalf of students, whether that was at the University of Leicester, whether that was nationally for students at NUS, but now in a different role, advocating perhaps more generally on behalf of the higher education system, working with business.
Fantastic. And your role as president of the NUS coincided with the rise in tuition fees. How has that changed the relationship between students and universities and their responsibility in terms of the journey after university?
Yeah, I think we'd started to see a shift in terms of the way in which students were engaging with their higher education experience because of the introduction of tuition fees. They're trebling to £3,000, and then of course they're trebling for a second time to £9,000. And steady research over 2 decades now has shown that students are increasingly saying that their principal reason for entering higher education is in order to gain employment, and also to gain an advantage in employment once they get there. Indeed, for students, it's not just a case of getting a job, it's getting a good job. Often for many, it's getting a graduate level job, and even when they're in that job, getting promoted once they're there. If you look at the management teams of businesses, both large and small in the UK and globally, they are still overwhelmingly led by graduates that have come from the university system. And so there are lots of advantages to being a graduate, and students in the system want to maximise that opportunity. I think for many students, when they're at university, they are thinking about the kinds of things and activities they can undertake to enhance their employability earlier on. Sometimes that's formally engaging with the structures that the university might have, the career service, and other supports that universities provide, but it's as much to do with other informal activities that students are undertaking, whether that's voluntary work, whether that is other kinds of volunteering like in societies and so on, and for many it's taking part-time jobs, which has a dual role of providing some crucial financial support to them whilst they're a student, whether that's paying for the basics like books and food, or whether it's for others paying for what you might describe as luxuries like going out and meeting other people, but I describe as a pretty integral part of being a student as well. But it also has a dual and secondary importance as providing crucial work experience that can often be an important distinction between someone that gets a job and someone that doesn't once they graduate.
So what would your advice be to somebody starting their university journey this September? We're obviously getting to that time of year where people are thinking about finishing and getting their A-level results and then starting at university in September. So what would your advice be to somebody right at the start of that journey?
Well, my first bit of advice would be enjoy yourself because it's a fantastic opportunity, and whether you're in a campus-based or a city-based university, whether it's large or small, you're almost certainly going to meet some quite amazing people from such diverse and different backgrounds. You'll see things that you've never seen before. You'll get the chance to do things you've never done before, whether that's run a radio station or hear from some wonderfully intellectual people, or meet people from different corners of the globe that you haven't. So I would stress the importance of enjoying yourself, but I'd also think quite shrewdly and smartly about making the most of those opportunities as well, making the most of the academic experience, but also the extracurricular experience as well. I would also give advice not to leave thinking about getting a job until too late. It shouldn't be what governs the university experience, but it's something that's worth thinking about from day one. And I think the shrewdest and the smartest students are discerning about making sure that they've got enough on their CV that isn't just a qualification, making sure that they're constantly thinking about what their strengths are and taking them to the next level, and perhaps also thinking about what their weaknesses are if it's presenting in front of groups, whether it's undertaking group work, it might be, being a completer, a finisher on a task. Whatever they might be, almost certainly you'll get the opportunity to engage in those activities and those skills whilst you're at university, and then thinking about how you can get better at those as well.
And we talked earlier about businesses' collaborations with universities themselves. Do businesses now have a responsibility to work with students directly to improve their employability, or is that something that the universities should take the lead on?
I think it's a shared responsibility. It's probably a tripartite responsibility. I think universities are principally there to provide high quality education, great teaching and excellent research, but I think they need to do it with a view to thinking about how it can support destinations afterwards, and that might be an academic career, but it's more likely to be in the world of work, and it's actually most likely to be in a small and medium-sized business for most graduates. I think businesses have a responsibility to acknowledge that what they receive in terms of graduates is not the final product, and nor should it be, but they should have basic expectations about literacy, numeracy, working in groups, a level of professionalism that all graduates should come out with, because that's part of getting a higher level skill. But I think businesses should also have their own training and development programs to make sure that, to adjust to a particular industry, their new graduate starters can really hit the ground running as quickly as possible. And then finally, there's obviously a responsibility on the individual to make sure they're making the most of the experiences and opportunities that they get at university, but also doing their research on the type of industry they might want to go into, the type of sector they might be thinking about, the particular kind of employer, to make sure they do their best to prepare as well as they can do.
So the university journey is an accrual of skills to take you into employment after you graduate. What can students be doing to showcase these skills to employers?
I think there's a whole host of things that are available to students to showcase their skills. There's all the traditional things like the CV and undertaking formal work experience, but there's a whole new way of being able to demonstrate that. I mean, we've seen these high-profile examples of students that accompanying their CVs with sort of videos describing what they're doing. There's basic things like using networking tools to both articulate the sorts of skills that they've got, but also using networks both formally through the people that they know and social networks that are available to them to explore the sorts of questions they might be asking, to find out about the experiences of fellow students or recent graduates or employers articulating what they're looking for. I'm fairly convinced that the students that are prepared to do the research, engage in these networks, are the ones that will leave themselves with the best chances to get work, but also work out what they don't want to do as much as what they want to do too.
And you mentioned social networks. What sort of opportunities does that give to a graduate to market themselves to a potential employer? And equally, what are the pitfalls about using social media in that way?
Well, in theory, having a presence on social media in relation to kind of reaching prospective employers, in some ways it's almost limitless. You potentially can use it as a route to find and engage with employers that are in different parts of the country, or indeed even in different parts of the globe. I think it can take you to sectors that you perhaps haven't had any formal face-to-face contact with at any time. And I think crucially also it can give you a form of contact with businesses you might not have had a chance to see at a careers fair, or might not have visited your campus, or might not have an HQ in the town that you live in or the university that you've gone in and studied at. So I think it kind of has almost a fantastic opportunity to kind of open the doors to a whole new set of employers you subsequently previously wouldn't have had the chance to engage with. But I think, it's important to think about the kind of image and presentation that you've got on these online platforms. I know that there's exhaustive amounts of press coverage about cautioning students to think about how they position themselves on the conventional and mainstream social platforms like Facebook, particularly, and to an extent Twitter. And that is important. The rule of thumb I've always had, really, with platforms of any sort, is if I wouldn't be prepared to say something to someone's face, then I probably wouldn't be prepared to put it online. That's not to say that, when you're messaging people in closed communities, yes, you can treat them like your friends because you can be assured as to who's in those environments. But I think certainly to publicly facing aspects of any of these sites, you've got to be conscious that you can be judged literally by the cover. The book is judged by its cover in these instances, and therefore you've got to be very attentive to what first impressions might look like.
Definitely. And you've ran your own consultancy. What sort of skills did it take to start your own business and obviously carry that on through to success? And what sort of opportunity does being at university present to a young person thinking about starting their own business?
I have to say, of all the things that I sought to do, and I haven't got a lengthy career, but I've been lucky to have done a range of different roles, elected roles, formal employment. In some ways, setting up my own business, a consulting business that undertakes work with government and with universities and with businesses, actually was probably the most nerve-wracking thing that I had to do. I didn't know what it took to set up a business. I didn't know some of the kind of the basic things about registering a company with Companies House and setting up a bank account, a business bank account, making sure that I submit my VAT returns, all the sort of making sure my accounts were up to scratch and fit and proper and so on. All those sorts of things I hadn't really learned formally through the education system. I was lucky that some of this information I was able to find online, but some of it still, that although I read the instructions, I couldn't still quite understand. And so speaking to people that had set up their own businesses actually was very helpful for me, and sort of that mentoring role was really valuable. But I think the basic principles that come with setting up a business, things like identifying what your product is, ensuring that can be effectively marketed and communicated to people, the ability to develop networks that often translate into business, whether they're face-to-face networks or whether they're online networks, are the kinds of skills that you can look practically into any degree programme or any voluntary or volunteering work that goes on for lots of students. And you can make translations. I can see elements of what I've done in setting up a successful business in my kind of experience as a student. That was hugely helpful. And I think I would say to anyone that's got a really great idea that sits there thinking, I believe people would want this product or would pay for this product or would want this service, then actually to take the plunge, think about it deeply, speak to people, but have the confidence to know it can be successful. Because again, I think technology has played a huge role in making sure that the services that I have provided and provide can get to audience that otherwise wouldn't have had the chance to perhaps 10 or 15 years ago.
And you talk about identifying what your product is and how to market that properly, and that entrepreneurial mindset. How can a student take that mindset and use that in terms of their career? So taking an entrepreneurial mindset and applying that to themselves and what they've got to offer the employment market.
Yeah, and I think being an entrepreneur, having an entrepreneurial spirit, isn't just confined, as some people might have it said, to setting up your own business. I think we have, and we need more entrepreneurial spirit within conventional businesses, large and small. I think the kinds of traits that we're looking for are thinking about, well, how can you extend your reach? How can you develop your market? How can you bring new things to market? How can you constantly be thinking about what we're doing and what more can we be doing? Essentially, that's at the heart of innovation, really. It's about never really sitting on your laurels and thinking, well, the current portfolio of stuff is exactly right. I'm sure there are new things that we can do. And essentially that's just identifying where that need is. It's listening sufficiently close to whether it's members, whether it's customers, whether it's stakeholders, and hearing about what they want, and then thinking, well, what skills or expertise or knowledge do I have, or people that I can bring that they would want to hear from.
Excellent. And from a personal point of view, are there any particular books or films or people that have been of particular inspiration to you?
Yeah, I would say first and foremostly, having known some people that set up businesses actually was really helpful, and that was as much to have the confidence to hear about their stories to set up their businesses, so particularly in that aspect. that was really helpful in terms of physical of contacts. I remain impressed by hearing stories or reading articles about individuals that have been successful, particularly those that don't come from conventional backgrounds where lots of people they know, or indeed anyone they know, has set up businesses. I mean, someone specifically like Richard Branson. I know he's an often cited example, but I think he has an incredibly powerful story to tell. Particularly bearing in mind where he came from and how he's managed to diversify his business over time, and how he's managed to modernise the various businesses that he's got into a sort of a successful 21st century businessman. So that would be one very remote example from where I am, and then personal mentors closer to home are really valuable too.
People who are graduating this July, what would your advice be to them?
It remains a pretty tough but improving employment labour market. I think the crucial bits of advice I'd give to people graduating from the university system this coming July is to persevere and to be patient, to be reflecting on the experiences that they've had formally in the curriculum and outside of the curriculum that they feel would give them a step up in the jobs market. To identify, if they haven't already, where their passions lie, because I really can't stress enough, it makes such a difference if you work in a world where you care what you're doing, you enjoy what you're doing, you're meeting interesting people, you think what you're doing has an impact of value and of worth. I'd also say not to get disheartened if the dream job doesn't look like it's there immediately as you graduate, or even 6 months after you graduate. Plenty of my friends, colleagues and peers, sometimes it didn't arrive, sometimes 2-3 years after they graduated, and it might seem a long way off, but it's worth retaining that sense of perspective, because although it might be 2 difficult years, for those of us graduating, in our early 20s, now, still will have possibly 50 years of work ahead of us, at least until we can receive a state pension. So, it is a long haul journey, and it's worth thinking about the different milestones. And the final thing I would encourage people to do is to actually talk to other people, again, whether that is people they know in their immediate network, or whether that's just sharing experiences online. I don't think you can hear enough about how other people's journeys have gone, the advice and hints and tips that other people would give, because often they can be very helpful in formulating your own personal approach.
And what are your aspirations and goals going forward from here?
Well, I want to really make sure that the organisations I'm doing work with see the value of whether it's businesses working with universities, and that can have a really transformational impact. I think longer term, I am keen to want to return to the charitable sector at some point. I loved the experience I had at NUS, which had the beauty of both being a campaigning organisation, doing good work in and of itself in the third charitable sector, and crucially, as a consequence of that work, changing people's lives. I'm finding it really valuable to see how businesses actually do engage with whether it's the university system or the charitable system. But I think in the long run, I'd like to identify a charity with a cause that I particularly care about, and hopefully extending their good work in the years to come.
And if you were starting your university journey again this year, would you do anything different? What course would you take? And how do you see your story panning out?
I think in some ways, although it was more by accident rather than by design, I felt very lucky that I chose a great course in English literature, a university that I really enjoyed, in a city that I really had a fantastic time spending 3 years as a student and then 2 years in the Students' Union. So in terms of those crucial decisions, I suspect I wouldn't do a great deal differently. If anything, I was quite lucky that I felt self-motivated to take up most of the opportunities that were presented to me. But there were still things where, actually, in retrospect, those idle hours sitting around where I wasn't doing things at times, actually, it would have been great to have shoehorned even more things in. And if you think about it, when you flick through the pages of the prospectus and when you walk around a university campus, there are so many things you could be doing, whether it is taking up a new sport, learning a new skill through a society, volunteering in different communities, whether it's in schools or old people or disadvantaged communities, whether it's learning a new language, whether it's getting work experience. And I think it's almost impossible to do all of those things, but I think being really determined to do as many of those things you can, I'd want to make sure I did as many, ticked off the things I did do and probably tick off a few more.
If there was one particular skill that you could identify as being the most important in a career, what would that be?
I think the most important skill really is about being determination. I think is what I would cite as being the most important. I think if you just sort of take on the approach that you'll do what you need to do, the bare minimum, or kind of tick the boxes that are just required to do the job to a basic standard, you'll only ever get so far, and actually you'll only ever get a certain amount of satisfaction. I think being determined and linked to that enthusiastic will mean that you're making the most of your experience, but also you're probably delivering the most as well. And if you've got that level of determination, in some respects, it almost doesn't matter what kind of size of organisation you're in, large or small, or what sector you're in. That can be directly applicable to a whole range of different spheres and sectors.
And finally, do you see higher education in its current form evolving in the next 10 years? Are the way courses are delivered going to change? And is the increase in tuition fees going to have a difference in the fact that students are now seen more as a consumer as an opposed to a passive learner?
Yeah, I think we've started to see a number of changes in the university system over the last few years. There has been an increased emphasis on employability, but I think most students are hoping that will increase yet further. I think we will start to see universities have to change even more, and I think there's a couple of things that they'll need to be particularly responsive to. One, I think, is student demand. I think that is that they'll need to provide more courses that students actually say they want, rather than universities have historically offered. And at the moment, I think the balance is possibly still with the university saying this is what we've always offered, and so we'll continue to do that. But I think as student demand shifts, so will university, how they respond to that. But I also think business demand will shape the way in which universities operate as well, and that might be universities being more attuned to where we anticipate labour market needs will go in the future. If there's clear demand in particular sectors, whether that's pharmaceuticals or advanced manufacturing, or whether that's the creative and digital sector, or whether that's data anthropologists or computer scientists, if the labour market is sending out signals that we need more people or more graduates in particular disciplines, then I think universities have a responsibility, but not entirely on their own, but they have a responsibility to respond to those needs in terms of the discipline areas. And then I think in terms of the specific skills, they need to do more to weave that into the curriculum more effectively. But I also think, finally, that we'll need to see more examples of universities being flexible to allow students to study and work at the same time. Ironically, we've actually seen a quite significant decline in the number of part-time students. I think that's as much to do with the funding regime as it is to do with students perhaps wanting to study and learn study and work at the same time. I think we do need to have universities that don't just see the provision of qualifications as something that you do intensively for 3 years, often travelling away from home. I think it should be open to allow people to study for a couple of days each week and work for a few days, to maybe have gaps in between study, to maybe do it intensively for 2 years, although that comes with some challenges too.
So thanks very much. That was Aaron Porter, former president of the NUS and currently of the NCUB. Thanks very much for your time.